At the end of May 1916, the Royal Navy and Imperial German Navy would clash at the Battle of Jutland, and during the battle, the Royal Navy would lose 3 prominent battle cruisers to catastrophic magazine detonations, resulting in roughly 3,000 casualties between the 3 ships. The destruction of these 3 ships is often analyzed, focusing on the events of the battle, since that's where they exploded. But the question we're going to look at today is, did the Royal Navy ever consider such a catastrophic disaster occurring prior to the Battle of Jutland? In order to answer this question, we must go back several decades before any of these 3 ships were even conceived and look at the Royal Navy's selection of ammunition, which means the shells themselves and the propellant charges. There were 3 relevant wars prior to World War I that involved excessive naval battles that the Royal Navy examined and took lessons from. These were the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95, the Spanish-American War of 1898, and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5. On the 17th of September 1894, the Battle of Yalu River took place, and as far as the Royal Navy was concerned, there were 2 Chinese warships of interest that were heavily damaged during the battle. These were the ironclads Chen Yuan and Ting Yuan. Between these 2 ironclads, the Japanese scored roughly 350 hits of varying caliber sizes, but there were 2 important lessons that the Royal Navy would draw from these vessels. The first one was, leading up to the Battle of Yalu River, the Royal Navy was under the impression that if the unarmored bow and stern of a capital ship was severely damaged by shell fire, it would lead to excessive flooding that would eventually result in capsizing. These 2 ironclads, surviving such extensive damage, showed the Royal Navy that that conclusion was false. Regardless of how much damage the unarmored bow or stern of a warship took, progressive flooding was necessary in order for the ship to eventually lose its positive buoyancy, resulting in it capsizing and sinking. While inspecting the compound armor of the warships, it was recognized that the Japanese had scored a 12.6-inch shell hit on a 14-inch thick plate and only dented it. Considering that the battle took place at a distance of 2,000 to 2,500 yards, it was expected that this shell would have been capable of penetrating upwards of 20 inches of this type of armor. So, seeing that it had only been dented, surprised the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy concluded that armor performed better under actual battle conditions than on the firing range during test, and while there could be some truth to this, it's also possible that the Japanese shell was faulty, resulting in it failing to explode. The Royal Navy completely skipped the possibility that the shell was simply faulty. The Royal Navy took interest in 2 battles from the Spanish-American War. These would have been the battles of Manila and Santiago. Interest in these 2 battles did not revolve around these shells being used, but rather the performance of gunnery between the 2 sides and the performance of damage control in relation to fires. The Royal Navy noted that the primary cause of Spanish losses was the result of excessive fires that blazed out of control, but fortunately for the Royal Navy, they were already aware of the faults in warship design that would result in excessive fires leading to the loss of a ship, and their most recent ships had been constructed already to avoid such issues, and during test, their alterations had proved solid. What could not be ignored from these results was that older warships in the Royal Navy that did not have such precautions taken would be a liability in a battle line due to the possibility of excessive fires. Moving on to the Russo-Japanese War, there were 2 primary battles that the Royal Navy was interested in. The Battle of the Yellow Sea on the 10th of August 1904, and the Battle of Tsushima on the 27th of May 1905. During the war, the Japanese would fire 2 different types of armor-piercing shells, with the primary difference being their bursting charges as the result of the Battle of the Yellow Sea. During the Battle of the Yellow Sea, the Japanese armor-piercing shell had a 5% bursting charge, and it was filled with a material called shimose, which was nearly identical to the Royal Navy's lyddite. During the Battle of the Yellow Sea, the Japanese fired just shy of 300 armor-piercing shells. Of these shells that managed to hit thick Russian armor, that being greater than 6 inches in thickness, not a single one penetrated. On top of that, the Japanese only had 12 12-inch guns available during the battle, and 3 shells prematurely detonated within 3 of those guns, resulting in them being disabled for the remainder of the fight. Prior to the Battle of Tsushima, as a result of lessons from the Yellow Sea, the Japanese redesigned the shell fuse, which would hopefully prevent premature detonations within the gun barrels and also help increase the penetration performance. And this increased fuse time did not appear to increase the penetration of the shells, as following the battle, as far as anyone could tell, none of the Japanese big armor-piercing shells managed to penetrate more than 6 inches of armor. As for the Russian Navy's battleships, they fired armor-piercing shells filled with wet gun cotton, which was less sensitive than shimose or lyddite, but they had more armor-piercing capabilities. Unfortunately, once these shells managed to penetrate thick armor, they would often fail to explode. Upon examining the Japanese ships following the Battle of Tsushima, it appears that one Russian 12-inch shell managed to successfully penetrate the 6-inch belt of the battleship Shikishima, and the shell managed to explode after completing penetration, resulting in what quite possibly was the only successful 12-inch armor-piercing shell fired during the entire war. Aside from the Royal Navy's examination of those 3 wars, they also conducted a series of live firing trials on warships within their own waters, the first relevant one taking place in 1900 on the ironclad Belle Isle. The Royal Navy wanted to examine 3 primary points during the Belle Isle trials. They wanted to understand the risk of British warships catching fire after precautions to avoid fire had been taken, to give the Royal Navy the idea between the extent of damage caused by various types of shells, and to give the Royal Navy an idea of how to address damage after it had occurred on one of their warships. The battleship Majestic would fire on the Belle Isle for a period of 7 minutes, starting at a distance of 1,700 yards and closing to 1,000 yards. During this period, it would fire a total of 7 12-inch armor-piercing shells, 8 12-inch common shells, 100 6-inch lyddite-filled shells, 100 6-inch common shells, 400 12-pounder common shells, and 750 3-pounder armor-piercing shells. Now, what's important for the sake of this video was the results between the 2 different types of 6-inch shell. The 6-inch lyddite shells were fired at the forward end of the Belle Isle, while the 6-inch common shells were fired at the after end. It was recognized that areas struck by the lyddite shells suffered from large irregular holes that would be impossible to repair at sea, and 6 small fires were also started by the lyddite. It was also recognized that all of the fire mains and water pumps within the relevant area had been successfully destroyed, which meant that in the event these fires were to spread, which in the case of these trials they did not because of preparations taken to contain fires in clearing for action, the crew would have had no possibility of stopping them should the fires have spread. As for the common shells, they would pierce the armor and then explode inside, assuming the shell successfully exploded. Now, while internal sections of the ship could be destroyed as a result of the shell successfully exploding, it was recognized that holes placed along the ship's hull could theoretically be repaired through patchwork while at sea, preventing the loss of the ship. It was also theorized that the large irregular holes caused by the lyddite shells would demoralize the crew greater than that of the relatively small holes caused by common shells. In 1907, the Royal Navy decided to conduct another test in relation to ammunition, but this time it would not be firing trials against armor, but rather fires taking place within a ship's primary magazine filled with common shells, lyddite-filled shells, and cordite propellant charges. The Royal Navy was aware that lyddite was a rather unstable material, but they were also aware that cordite could be even more unstable as a result of deterioration over time. They were also aware that high temperatures within magazines and contamination of cordite, which would have occurred during manufacture, could also accelerate the deterioration and increase the unstable values of cordite, and so Their magazines were designed to not exceed a temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and precautions were taken to individually seal cordite propellant charges so that should one spontaneously combust, it would not rapidly spread, resulting in a full-blown magazine detonation. The aging warship Colossus was selected to take part in these trials, as if a magazine detonation occurred, the ship's loss would not be important to the Navy, and Admiral Tupper would describe the results of these trials following the Battle of Jutland. "We tried the effect of exploding some cases of cordite in a filled magazine, specially fitted to evacuate gas above a certain pressure. Everybody thought the magazine would explode, but it did not, and I am still at a loss to know just how it was that the Queen Mary and Invincible blew up at Jutland. Personally, I felt quite sure that even if flames got into the magazine, it would not explode, while since this opinion had been strengthened by the result of the Colossus experiments, we had taken additional precautions to prevent it." Admiral Tupper's account mentions that precautions had been taken even following the successful results of the Colossus trials. These improvements were the installation of machinery that ensured temperatures within magazines did not exceed 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the expansion of ventilation to prevent the buildup of pressure by adding vents at the top of the bulkheads separating the magazines and handling rooms. This allowed any buildup of pressure to escape, but did not allow pressures to enter. And finally, the installation of brass casings, which would house a single propellant charge each, keeping the charges separated from one another so that fires did not spread amongst several charges. In 1910, another firing trial was held against the target ship Edinburgh, which would receive several 13.5, 9.2, and 6-inch shell hits, both of lyddite and powder types. The results of this trial were as follows. The lyddite-filled shells were extremely formidable weapons, causing an excessive smashing effect which opened up the ship's side, breaking several decks and bulkheads, but it was noted that the splintering effect caused by lyddite shells was minor. Powder-filled shells were seen as more effective against the internal structure of a ship, as upon a successful detonation, the shell caused excessive splintering, which penetrated several bulkheads. Due to the different types of effects that were seen as a result of the two different shells, it was recommended that both lyddite and powder-filled shells be used in real battle scenarios. Finally, in 1913, another firing trial was conducted against the battleship Empress of India using the cruiser Liverpool and the battleships Thunderer, Orion, King George V, Neptune, Vanguard, and King Edward VII. Like the previous gunnery trials, shells filled with lyddite and powder were used, both seeing successful results, with Empress of India burning and sinking by the end of the trials. The excessive damage taken to Empress of India, resulting in its sinking, gave the impression that the Royal Navy's mixture of shells proved highly effective in dealing with armored targets, but unfortunately, this was false, as lyddite was not good against armored warships. As was already mentioned, lyddite caused minor weak splintering that was unable to penetrate bulkheads. This also applies to armor plate. When a lyddite shell struck thick armor plate, it would either fail to explode, or it would explode on the armor, but fail to actually cause any form of penetration to the armor. While the higher ranks of the Royal Navy understood this fault with lyddite shells, this was not communicated to the lower ranks of the Navy, whom would actually serve in battle, and so, when the Royal Navy went into the Battle of Jutland, most of the crew members aboard the battlecruisers and battleships were under the impression that their lyddite shells would make quick work of armored targets, unaware of the results that would come. It was not until after the Battle of Jutland that the higher-ups in the Navy properly communicated the downsides of lyddite shell to the common sailor. It was also recognized following the Battle of Jutland that the trials conducted on Colossus regarding magazine detonations were faulty, and, as a result, new precautions had to be placed into both operation and design surrounding magazine safety. It was very unfortunate that in the 2 decades prior to the Battle of Jutland, the Royal Navy had collected numerous results regarding shell types and magazine safety, and ultimately They communicated their ideas poorly to the sailors, and also they were narrow-minded in their approaches, which resulted in solid conclusions being drawn where they probably should not have been, and ultimately this contributed to the 3,000 deaths between their battlecruisers and, of course, the loss of the battlecruisers themselves. As cruel as it was, this is certainly a case where a real battle proved to be the ultimate test. With that having been said, there is nothing more I wish to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.